"Where is he?" Shillian asked. The three entered the small pavilion, and within the building there was no one. The spiritual devices and treasures were still in the same places as they had been set up before. Only, once the doors were opened, they had all become useless. Shillian shouted in the communication array, "Lord Windmaster, where are you?" On the way over, because they were so focused on rushing and Chichingshan was overly agitated, Shillian had proposed that he meditate to calm down, to stop thinking and saying nonsense and scaring himself. Chichingshan thought that it made a lot of sense and gradually stopped talking, so the lack of response wasn't out of the blue. Thus, Shillian hadn't noticed anything amiss. But now, no matter how he yelled, there was no answer, and a feeling of dread started to spread in his heart. In a situation like this, there could only be two possibilities. Either Chichingshan was not responding on purpose, or he had already lost consciousness. There were over 10 spiritual devices and treasures on the Windmaster's person, each of them rare and exquisite, and they had all been used by Shillian to set the formation of the array. There should be nothing from the outside that could easily break through. Even if it could be done, just as Chichingshan had said, it would take at least 3 days and 3 nights, and it would be impossible not to leave evidence of a break-in. Yet, from the looks of it, the doors and windows of the small pavilion were still intact, and there were also no tunnels or ladders. Shillian went back to the entrance and picked up the golden locket on the ground, looking it over closely. He really did open the doors himself, he said. Even though reinforcements were clearly arriving momentarily, for what reason would he seek a dead end for himself at the last minute? Maybe he thought that the one at the door was us, Mingyi said gravely. Hearing this, an abominable image suddenly appeared in Shillian's mind. From outside the small pavilion came 3 individuals, each in the appearance of himself, Hua Chang and Mingyi, and they knocked on the doors. Within the pavilion, an overjoyed Chichingshan immediately opened the doors, and the 3 people outside surrounded him, grinning at him eerily. The golden locket in Chichingshan's hand fell to the ground next to his feet, never to be picked up. Shillian immediately shook his head. "That's impossible," he said. "I've never heard that the Reverend of Empty Words has the ability to fake appearances." "Maybe it called for helpers," Mingyi suggested. Shillian gave it a thought, but also dismissed it. Everything that we ran into today was sudden and unforeseen. Before this, we hadn't thought that there'd be a need for an array to shield the Windmaster, so it too shouldn't have been able to find any ghosts to help so quickly. Besides, didn't we tell Lord Windmaster that we'd inform him in the communication array when we arrived? Whether the ones outside the doors were real or fake, it would have been easy to figure out by just asking. So how could he be so easily deceived? Coming to this point, Shillian suddenly stopped. Then he started mumbling. Unless it was someone he knew who told him to open the doors. Someone he knew? Mingyi questioned. How so? Just then, Hua Chang spoke up. His ears were plugged. He can't hear. Shillian immediately seized his arm and exclaimed, "Well said, Sanhang. It was exactly for that reason that I said it must be someone he knew. Because Lord Windmaster had his ears plugged, he wouldn't have been able to hear anything from the outside, unless he removed the earplugs. But would he do that? He was so terrified he'd die before he would. So to deceive him and to have him open the door, there was only one way it could be done: his private communication array." Shillian started to talk faster, which means while we were coming, there was someone who secretly connected with Lord Windmaster and told him something that made him open the doors on his own. If it wasn't someone that he was close to, they wouldn't have known Lord Windmaster's verbal password. The verbal password of heavenly officials are all closely guarded secrets, not to be known by outsiders, and especially not to demons and monsters, the like of that reverend of empty words. Also, it should have been someone he trusted deeply, otherwise he wouldn't have opened the doors without thinking. Or, Hua Chang said, he didn't know this person, but this person knew him and gave him a reason he couldn't refuse, giving him no choice but to open the doors. Shilian seriously considered that possibility and said, technically, we can send messages to the Wind Master as long as we have the verbal password. But to have a strange voice suddenly speak, wouldn't Lord Windmaster think it weird? He should have told us in the communication array the moment he heard, unless this mysterious individual who sent the private communication paralyzed him with the first message. But what message could it be? A threat? Mingyi wondered. Shilian said, how could it threaten? If you don't come out, I'll tell your brother I've returned to harass you. But immediately dismissed the thought. Not likely. That reverend of empty words shouldn't be aware of Shi Qingshuan's concerns. Besides, it wasn't a heavenly official, so how could it let the Water Master know immediately of its existence? Reinforcements would arrive within the hour, but Shi Qingshuan couldn't even wait that long. At the end of the day, whether that creature could win against the Water Master was another matter entirely. It bore mentioning that it had never harassed Shi Wudu. It only had eyes for Shi Qingshuan, picking especially at the lower hanging fruit. No doubt, the Reverend itself was scared of the Water Master, so it wouldn't have provoked him directly. Search for another hour, Mingyi said. Shilian understood what he wanted to say and nodded. All right, he said. If we still can't find him after an hour, no matter how much Lord Windmaster protests, the Lord Watermaster must be informed. Let's break up. We'll search this way, and Lord Earthmaster, please search over there. Mingyi turned around and left without a word. Shilian jogged as he searched and never gave up calling for Shi Qingshuan in the communication array. But he remained dead silent. How goes it? Hua Chang asked. Shilian shook his head. No response whatsoever, he said. The dread in his mind was growing heavier. He searched chamber after chamber of every wing in the entire pavilion and was almost through with all the pavilions nearby, yet there were no traces at all. Soon after, the two came to the tallest pavilion in the area. This pavilion was obviously the star of its surroundings, the centerpiece. It was renovated multiple times, glamorous and impressive, with a number of poetry verses written on the walls. Shilian raised his head to look at the establishment plaque, which read, "The Terrace of Cascading Wine." He wondered out loud, is it the young lord who poured wine? That's right, Hua Chang answered. This is the original address to the young lord who poured wine. So it really is related? Shilian asked and looked at him. Yeah, Hua Chang replied, then briefly gave an account. In the legends, they said that when Shi Qingshuan was still mortal, after training, he would often come to this place to drink, spread out drunkenly upon the terrace, happy and carefree. One day, below the deck, came a malicious crook who often bullied the good villagers. When Shi Qingshuan saw him, he nonchalantly spilt the delicate wine from his cup and cast a tiny spell. That wine spilt right over that crook's head and knocked him out. After Shi Qingshuan was appointed a deputy general by Shi Wudu, he still loved the mortal realm and continued to drink endlessly at this place like before. The day he ascended was also when he was here drinking. To ascend whilst drinking sounded absurd, but it actually wasn't anything of the sort. Sometimes opportunities came knocking without any rhyme or reason. Shilian himself was still sleeping when he ascended. Perhaps in future there would be heavenly officials who would ascend while they were in the bathroom, which might very well become a renowned sight as well. In any case, stories of scholars teasing guests had always been popular throughout history, and places that had these stories would always incite the urge for intellectuals to raise their brush and create, expressing their yearning for a heavenly lifestyle. Shilian now understood that this place was one of such landmarks. There were no tourists in the middle of the night, but the next day there would for sure be many tourists who would discover, astonished, that the houses and trees had been blown away, and cry that the Wind Master had shown up. However, the renowned sight of the young lord who poured wine was slightly different from what Shilian had imagined. Just then, he heard Hua Chang say darkly, "Gerger, I need to go take care of something small. Please do be careful, I won't be long." Take care of what? Shilian wondered mentally. When he recalled Hua Chang's angry voice in the private communication array and now his unfriendly demeanor, he asked, "Are you going to find that reverend of empty words?" Hua Chang paused for a moment, then replied, "No." If it wasn't that, then it wasn't his place to ask any more, so Shilian nodded. "You were only here for fun anyway," he said. "Since something's come up, just go. You take care of yourself, too." Hua Chang said. After a pause, he added, "When I come back, I'll tell you something." Shilian was taken aback and blurted out, "What?" But Hua Chang's figure had already disappeared. After an hour, there was still nothing, and Shilian called out in the communication array, "Lord Earthmaster, how are things on your side? I haven't found him here, so I'm coming back." "Nothing," Mingyi answered. "This won't do. I can't hold back any longer," Shilian said. "Let's meet up at the center of the Terrace of Cascading Wine. I'm going to report to Lord Watermaster right now." After that, he immediately mouthed Ling Wen's verbal password to her private communication array. "Ling Wen," he said, "are you there? Can you find Lord Watermaster? Please tell him to come meet me at the Terrace of Cascading Wine at his earliest notice." The clear voice of a man rang next to his ears. It seemed that at this moment Ling Wen was in his male form. "Your Highness," he said, "Lord Watermaster is here with me right now. He's not someone who likes going out, so he probably won't descend. What business do you have with him? I can pass on the message." Just then, Shilian had almost reached the main building of the Terrace of Cascading Wine and saw from afar that the terrace seemed to be hung with something. It looked like a white cloth swinging in the night breeze. Shilian was taken aback, thinking, was there something there before? When he walked closer, he finally saw what it was. Wasn't that Shiqingxuan's outer robe? Just then, Mingyi roared in the communication array, "Your Highness, come immediately to the tallest pavilion at the Terrace of Cascading Wine. Hurry." Shilian jolted, and on the other end, Ling Wen was asking, "Your Highness, are you still there?" Shilian exclaimed, "Please have him descend as soon as possible. Something's happened to Lord Windmaster." After having shouted that last message, he charged up the pavilion. There were no more sounds from the other end. Ling Wen was probably shocked by his message and went reporting to Shawudu. When Shilian made it to the tallest floor, at the center of the floor, there lay a person, and it was Shiqingxuan. Shiqingxuan had both eyes tightly closed, and there were no external injuries on his person, and no traces of blood. Another person was helping him up. It was Mingyi. Shiqingxuan was propped up, unconscious, and something fell from his chest. Shilian fixed his eyes and felt his heart tighten. That thing was the Windmaster fan, and it was split in half. That rare spiritual device could only be possessed by chance and not by force. It might not even be forged after hundreds of years. It was the Windmaster's #1 spiritual device, yet it was destroyed just like that. When we came by just now, there was no one else, Shilian claimed. But just as the words left his mouth, he realized something else was amiss. Earlier, when he and Hua Chang came by, there were plenty of poetry verses on the wall left by literary guests, some charming, some arrogant, others elegant. But now they were all gone, as if someone had wiped them clean. leaving behind a phrase that didn't exist before, in crimson script. It was a row of large words, dripping with blood. Wretched beginning, wretched end, it said. It was a curse that the Reverend of Empty Words bestowed on Shi Xuan on the day of his birth. Just then, Ming Yi asked frigidly, "Your Highness, where's the other one that was with you?" Shilin was taken aback and thought, "Oh no, Sun Lang's left at such an inopportune moment." The moment he left his side, something happened to Shi Xuan. This really couldn't be explained clearly. However, Shilin showed nothing on his face and explained solemnly, "I asked him to go search for that Reverend of Empty Words." "When did he leave?" Ming Yi asked. Without changing his expression, Shilin replied, "Just now. He hasn't been gone for even half an instant's time." Truthfully, it was way longer than that. However, Shilin himself never doubted Hua Chang, so naturally he wouldn't let anyone else have the chance to doubt him either, lest more issues arise. Just then, from beyond the skies came waves of rolling thunder. A golden carriage of 8 wheels broke through the clouds, driving toward them with an imposing aura. Unable to reach the terrace of cascading wine using the distance-shortening array, it seemed Shawudu went straight for a golden carriage instead. It must be known that when a golden carriage of burnished horses was driven, it was a huge fanfare. If it should be seen by mortals who were stargazing up in the middle of the night, it would for sure be an uproar in the mortal realm. The water tyrant really wasn't afraid of anything. Watching that dramatic golden carriage approach, Shilin immediately said, "Lord Earthmaster, if any heavenly officials should ask later, please don't say a word about Lord Hua. There are many heavenly officials in the heavenly court who like to exaggerate and make up stories. This affair has nothing to do with him, so there's no need to make it complicated." Ming Yi gave him a look and said, "Very well." He agreed easily and looked down to keep checking Shi Xuan's condition. Shilin let out a breath of relief, but then, seeing the unmoving windmaster, his heart sank once more. That golden carriage came roaring, and soon after it landed with trails of propitious clouds. Outside the carriage were a small number of junior heavenly officials standing at the ready to serve, and 3 grand heavenly officials exited the vehicle. It was Shawudu, Pei Ming, and Ningwen. 3 of the top 10 at the mid-autumn banquet had all come at once. Of course, Shilin had long forgotten that he himself sat at the head of the top 10. Shawudu had deeply knitted brows, sweeping his sleeves as he got off the carriage with a frown. He entered the pavilion with his watermaster fan in hand, and Pei Ming and Lingwen following right behind. The moment he saw his younger brother lying on the ground like a corpse, his face instantly changed, and he rushed over. Qing Xuan, he said, "What's happened?" Shilin responded succinctly, "Lord Windmaster has run into the Reverend of Empty Words." "What did you say?" Shawudu exclaimed in disbelief. "The Reverend of Empty Words?" Hearing that name, not only Shawudu, but Pei Ming and Lingwen's faces also dropped. It seemed that they already knew of Shawudu's scourge. Watching their expressions, Shilin couldn't tell who was faking and who was secretly delighted. They were all acting naturally, especially Shawudu. There was definitely no way that he was acting. Lingwen retrieved a bunch of bottles from his sleeve and said, "Try feeding him, all of them." Pei Ming, on the other hand, remarked on the side, "It's you again, Your Highness." "It can't be helped," Shilin replied. "There's only so many of us going back and forth in the heavens. It seems every time we see you, the other one is always around too," Pei Ming said. "I wonder if it's the same case this time." Shilin replied flatly, No, of course not." He was lying through his teeth, but Ming Yi actually kept his promise and didn't utter a word. Pei Ming stopped talking waved his hand, and led the officials under his command to search the premises. Given the situation, it was actually better that Hua Chang had left beforehand. At least he wasn't at the scene of the crime. Shawudu couldn't wake Shiching Xuan, but his eyes inadvertently swept over to the giant bloody words on the snow-white wall, and his face twisted immediately. His face became whiter than the wall. Shaking with fury, he shouted, "Who wrote this? Who wrote it?" Even though he was shouting, his voice was trembling. Just then, Ling Wen exclaimed, "Lord Windmaster is awake." Shilin immediately squatted down. "Lord Windmaster?" he asked. Sure enough, Shi Qingshuan's eyes were slowly blinking open. Shawudu shoved everyone aside and cried, "Qingshuan, are you all right? Do you feel bad anyway? Who hurt you?" Shi Qingshuan was dazed for a good while as he slowly came to. When he became conscious, the first thing he saw was Shawudu's face. The next moment, something no one had expected happened. He shoved Shawudu away, grabbed his own head, and screamed.